Commander Valerie Apex had seen worse Tuesdays. Well, technically she hadn't, but she was an optimist, or at least that's what she told herself, while watching entire colonies get turned into very expensive glass sculptures by alien plasma bombardment. "Control! This is Patrol Unit 9, she barked into her comm unit, trying to sound professional despite the fact that her morning coffee had just become the least of her problems. "I'm seeing, well, let's call them uninvited guests, with very poor manners and really big guns." The response was a delightful symphony of static and screaming. Val sighed and switched off the comm. First rule of military service: when headquarters starts sounding like a horror movie soundtrack, you're officially on your own. Just one thing before we begin. YouTube tells me 97% of you watching aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free. It really supports the channel. And you'll get more amazing HFY sci-fi stories delivered straight to you. Don't miss out. She gunned her hover bike through the smoke-choked canyons of what used to be New Centauri Colony. The settlement had been a bustling mining town just 20 minutes ago. Now it looked like someone had used it for target practice, if that someone happened to be a particularly vindictive god with access to military-grade plasma cannons. The Vorthak had arrived without so much as a "how do you do?" or a declaration of war. Just massive black ships that looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a meat grinder, dropping out of hyperspace and immediately beginning what could generously be called aggressive urban renewal. Val rounded a corner and nearly ran over what appeared to be a small, furry landmine with eyes the size of dinner plates. She slammed on the brakes, her hoverbike's stabilizers whining in protest. The creature, definitely not human, possibly not from this dimension, let out a sound that was part squeak, part sob, and entirely heartbreaking. "Oh, come on," Val muttered, pulling off her helmet. "Really? Now?" The little alien couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall, covered in silver-blue fur that reminded her of her grandmother's favorite sweater. It clutched something that might have been a toy, or possibly a very small weapon, with alien tech. You never could tell. "Hey there, little guy," she said, keeping her voice low and steady. "You okay?" The creature's response was to point a tiny clawed finger at the burning ruins behind her and unleash a stream of what was definitely alien profanity. Val had heard enough species curse to recognize the universal patterns of frustration and grief. "Yeah, I get it," she said. "Bad day all around." That's when she noticed the other two. One was pressed against the collapsed wall of what used to be a market stall. This one was about the same size as the first, but covered in scales that seemed to shift color like oil on water. Currently, they were a mottled gray that blended perfectly with the rubble. The third was, well, calling it crystalline would be like calling a supernova a bit bright. The alien child appeared to be made of living gemstone, its surface catching and reflecting light in patterns that hurt to look at, directly. It was humming, a low, thrumming sound that seemed to resonate in her bones. 3 kids. 3 alien kids whose parents were probably decorating the landscape in a very permanent and unfortunate way. "Perfect," Val said to the universe at large. "Just what I needed." A field trip. The furry one, she decided to call it Pip because it reminded her of a mouse her sister used to have, took a hesitant step toward her bike. Its large eyes reflected the burning colony behind them, and Val felt something twist in her chest that had nothing to do with the smoke. "Listen, kids," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "We need to move. Those big scary ships up there, they're not done redecorating, and I really don't think any of us want to be here for the second act." The scaled one, Nyx seemed appropriate, flickered into visibility beside Pip, apparently having concluded that camouflage was less important than proximity to the only adult in the area who wasn't currently on fire. The crystalline child, coda, because of the humming, shifted its harmonic frequency to something that sounded almost like a question. Val looked at her watch. The evacuation ships were supposed to rendezvous at Landing Bay 12 in 43 minutes. It was a 15-minute ride if she pushed her bike and didn't run into any Vorthak patrols. With 3 alien kids who probably didn't speak standard and definitely didn't know how to ride on a military hoverbike, it was going to be tight. "Okay, new plan," she announced, standing up and checking her weapon. "Everybody on, and I mean everybody. We're going to—" The whine of incoming aircraft cut through the air like a knife through particularly optimistic butter. Val looked up to see 3 Vorthak fighters screaming overhead, their hulls black as space and twice as welcoming. "Down!" she shouted, grabbing Pip and diving behind her bike. Nyx vanished entirely. Apparently, their camouflage included some kind of active stealth. Coda's humming shifted to a higher frequency that made Val's teeth ache. The fighters strafed the area with methodical precision, their energy weapons turning rubble into smaller, more aerodynamic rubble. Val pressed herself against the ground and tried to make herself as small as possible, which was challenging given that she was wearing full combat armor and carrying enough ammunition to level a small building. When the shooting stopped, she risked a look up. The fighters were moving on to the next sector, apparently satisfied that anything worth killing in this area was now thoroughly deceased. "Everyone okay?" she whispered. Pip poked its head up from behind a chunk of what used to be someone's kitchen, fur singed but eyes bright. Nyx flickered back into visibility, scales now a worried shade of purple. Coda's humming had dropped to barely audible, a sound like distant wind chimes. Val did some quick calculations. 40 minutes to the rendezvous. Unknown number of Vorthak patrols between here and there. 3 alien kids who probably had never seen combat outside of their species' equivalent of action movies. She looked at their faces, or face analogs in Coda's case, and saw trust. Complete, absolute trust that she would somehow get them out of this mess. "Great," she muttered. "No pressure." She hauled herself to her feet and activated her bike's extended passenger mode, watching as the vehicle stretched and reconfigured itself to accommodate multiple riders. "All right, listen up," she said, adopting her best drill instructor voice. "We're going on a little road trip. The rules are simple. Hold on tight, don't let go, and if you see anything that looks like it wants to kill us, point it out. Quietly." Pip scrambled onto the bike behind her, tiny claws finding purchase on her armor. Nyx followed, scales shifting to match the bike's matte gray finish. Coda took the rear position, its crystalline form somehow managing to look both fragile and indestructible at the same time. "Everyone ready?" Val asked, not waiting for an answer before gunning the engine. They tore through the ruins of New Centauri colony at a speed that would have been illegal under normal circumstances and was merely suicidal under current ones. Val had driven through combat zones before, but never with passengers who weighed less than her ammunition pack and had even less experience getting shot at. The evacuation point was a commercial landing pad on the far side of the colony, nestled between 2 mining operations that had been converted into impromptu refugee centers. Val could see the transport ships in the distance, their hulls gleaming like hope made manifest. That's when the Vorthak patrol rounded the corner ahead of them. 3 soldiers in powered armor that made them look like walking nightmares, carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained destruction. They saw the bike immediately and raised their weapons with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke of extensive practice. Val had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether her passengers lived to see another sunrise or became very small, very sad statistics. She chose violence. Banking hard left, she opened fire with her bike's mounted pulse cannon while simultaneously deploying smoke grenades and praying to whatever deity looked after foolish humans and the alien children they'd somehow adopted. The world exploded into chaos. Energy beams sizzled past her helmet. Pip shrieked in what might have been terror or excitement. Nix's scales went full chameleon, shifting through a rainbow of camouflage patterns. Coda's humming spiked into a frequency that made the Vorthak stumble and clutch their helmets. Val didn't have time to appreciate the tactical implications of that last bit. She was too busy trying to thread her bike through weapons fire while keeping 3 small passengers from becoming small airborne passengers. They burst through the EP2 smoke cloud doing approximately twice the legal speed limit and headed straight for the landing pad. Vorthak energy bolts painting the air behind them in shades of violent death. "Hold on!" Val shouted over the noise of combat and high-performance hover engines. "This is going to get interesting." Behind her, she heard Pip make a sound that was either laughter or the alien equivalent of, "Are you completely insane?" Given the circumstances, both were probably appropriate responses. The landing pad was chaos. Refugees from a dozen species crowded around 3 transport ships, their captains clearly torn between waiting for more survivors and getting the hell out before the Vorthak decided to upgrade from selective targeting to wholesale slaughter. Val hit the brakes and brought the bike to a sliding stop beside the nearest transport, her passengers holding on with the grip of beings who had just discovered exactly how creative physics could be when properly motivated. "Move! Move! Move!" she shouted, helping the cubs off the bike and toward the transport's loading ramp. The ship's captain, a grizzled Terran with prosthetic arms and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen too much universe for one lifetime, took one look at her and nodded grimly. "Last transport out, Commander," he said. "We're lifting in 60 seconds, whether we're full or not." Val pushed the cubs up the ramp and followed them, her bike already forgotten in the face of more pressing concerns like not dying horribly in the next few minutes. As the transport's engines spun up and the ship began to lift, she caught a glimpse through the viewports of more Vorthak fighters incoming, their formation tight and professional. The cubs huddled against her, Pip's fur pressed against her armor, Nix's scales now a muted silver that somehow conveyed exhaustion, Coda's humming barely audible but oddly comforting. "Well," Val said to her unlikely charges as the transport shuddered under defensive fire, "that could have gone worse." Pip looked up at her with those enormous eyes and made a sound that she was learning to interpret as the alien equivalent of, "I'm pretty sure it's about to." Through the viewports, she could see the stars beginning to show as they climbed toward the safety of open space. Behind them, New Centauri colony burned like a funeral pyre for the innocents they'd all lost in the space of one very bad Tuesday morning. Val put her arms around the 3 small beings who had somehow become her responsibility and wondered exactly what she was going to do with them now that the immediate crisis of not dying had been temporarily resolved. The universe, as usual, wasn't offering any helpful suggestions. 3 weeks into what the military was generously calling a strategic withdrawal and what everyone else was calling running away really fast, Val had learned several important things about alien child rearing. First, Pip ate everything, and by everything she meant literally everything, including her emergency rations, her backup emergency rations, and what she'd been saving for a truly desperate emergency. The little Quellion had apparently been designed by evolution to be a furry garbage disposal with anxiety issues. Second, Nyx's camouflage abilities included disappearing completely when scared, which happened roughly every 15 minutes. This led to what Val had started calling invisible alien panic time, a delightful game where she had to locate a terrified, invisible child, while also trying not to get eaten by the local wildlife. Third, Coda's harmonic communications were beautiful, soothing, and absolutely useless when trying to explain basic concepts like, "Don't eat the glowing berries," or "That's not water, that's acid." "This is not how I plan to spend my career," Val muttered, watching Pip attempt to consume what appeared to be a rock, but was probably some kind of mineral supplement that Quellian physiology required. I was supposed to be fighting wars, not running a daycare center for the universe's most challenging children. They were camped in a cave system on Kepler Prime, a backwater world that had apparently been deemed too boring for the Vorthak to bother conquering immediately. The cave was spacious, defensible, and came with its own water source, assuming you didn't mind water that tasted like it had been filtered through a boot. Val had managed to contact other survivors through encrypted channels. The news was universally terrible. The Vorthak had rolled through the sector like a tide of destruction, overwhelming defenses that had taken decades to build in a matter of days. The remnants of the colonial fleet were scattered across a dozen systems, playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek, with an enemy that seemed to know exactly where everyone was hiding. "At least we're alive," she told herself, which was becoming her daily mantra. Alive and educational. Pip looked up from its rock-eating endeavor and made a series of chirping sounds that Val had learned meant either "I'm happy" or "I need to use the bathroom." With Pip, the distinction was often academic. "Yeah, I know, little guy," she said, checking her chronometer. Time for another survival lesson. Over the past weeks, she'd been trying to teach the cubs basic survival skills. The results had been mixed. Pip had mastered the art of finding edible things in impossible places, but couldn't seem to grasp the concept of stealth. Nyx was naturally gifted at hiding, but got panicked when separated from the group for more than 5 minutes. Coda could apparently communicate with the local wildlife through some kind of harmonic interface, but had no concept of physical danger. "All right, class," Val announced, using her drill instructor voice. "Today we're going to practice not dying horribly." It's a popular elective. She'd set up a basic obstacle course using fallen rocks and cave formations. The goal was simple: get from point A to point B without being detected by the enemy, represented by motion sensors she'd salvaged from her crashed transport. "Pip, you're up first," she said. "Remember, quiet and careful." Pip approached the course with the confidence of someone who had never met a challenge they couldn't eat. Within 30 seconds, every sensor was screaming, and the little Quellian was somehow tangled in its own fur. "Okay," Val said patiently. "Let's try that again. But this time, imagine the sensors are vegetables you don't want to wake up." Pip's ears perked up at the mention of food, and its second attempt was markedly better. Not good, but better. Progress was progress. Nyx went next, and Val had to admit she was impressed. The Drachmori could move like liquid shadow when motivated, flowing around obstacles with a grace that made her feel like a clumsy giant in comparison. The problem came when Nyx reached the halfway point and suddenly froze, scales flickering rapidly between colors. "What's wrong?" Val asked, keeping her voice low and calm. Nyx pointed at something beyond the course, a small, harmless cave, dwelling that had been curious enough to poke its head out to watch the proceedings. The alien child's scales had gone full alarm pattern, a swirling mix of red and black that practically screamed, "Danger!" It's okay, Val said, walking slowly toward Nix. It's just a local. See? No weapons, no hostile intent. Just curious. But Nix had already vanished, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air to mark where the terrified child had been. Val sighed and made a mental note. Separation anxiety was apparently a cross-species phenomenon. Coda, your turn, she said to the crystalline child, and maybe see if you can convince our invisible friend to come back. Coda's approach to the obstacle course was entirely its own. Instead of trying to avoid the sensors, it simply asked them not to notice it. The harmonic frequencies it produced seemed to interfere with the electronic systems in ways that Val was pretty sure violated several laws of physics. More interestingly, Coda's humming had a visible effect on Nix. The invisible child began to shimmer back into visibility, scales gradually shifting from panic patterns to something that looked almost like curiosity. Huh, Val said, making another mental note. That's actually useful. The training session was interrupted by the distinctive whine of aircraft engines echoing through the canyon outside their cave. Val immediately went into combat mode, gesturing for the cubs to get behind the largest rocks. Stay down. Stay quiet, she whispered, pulling out her field glasses to get a look at their visitors. 3 Vorthak patrol craft, flying in a standard search pattern. They weren't heading directly for the cave, but they were definitely looking for something. Or someone. Val watched them through her glasses, noting their flight patterns and weapon configurations. Standard scout ships. Fast, lightly armed, designed for reconnaissance rather than heavy combat. The kind of ships you sent when you wanted to find hidden survivors without wasting resources. We need to move, she whispered to the cubs. They're not going away, and it's only a matter of time before they expand their search pattern. But as she turned to gather their supplies, she realized she had a problem. The cubs weren't cowering behind rocks anymore. Pip was crouched at the cave entrance, those huge eyes fixed on the patrol ships with an intensity that was distinctly unsettling. Nix had positioned itself where it could see the aircraft while remaining in shadow, scales shifting to perfect camouflage patterns. Coda was humming very quietly, but the frequency seemed to be interfering with something. Val's comm unit was picking up static that corresponded exactly to the alien child's rhythm. "What are you 3 doing?" she hissed. Pip looked back at her and made a sound that was definitely not, "I'm scared." If Val had to translate, it would be closer to, "I'm really annoyed that these guys interrupted my rock-eating time." Nix flickered into visibility long enough to gesture at the patrol ships, then at Val's weapon, then back at the ships. The meaning was clear. Can we shoot them? Coda's humming shifted to a different frequency, and suddenly Val's comm unit was picking up Vorthak tactical chatter. "Wait," she said, staring at the cubs in amazement. Are you actually analyzing the enemy?" The 3 young aliens looked at her with expressions that managed to convey, "Well, obviously," despite the significant differences in facial structure between their species. Val felt something shift in her chest. These weren't helpless refugees anymore. They were learning, adapting, growing. "Okay," she said slowly. "New lesson plan. Advanced surveillance and tactical assessment." She spent the next hour teaching them how to properly observe enemy movements, identify weaknesses in patrol patterns, and coordinate their natural abilities for maximum effectiveness. Pip's enhanced senses could detect approaching threats long before conventional sensors. Nix's camouflage could provide perfect concealment for reconnaissance. Coda's harmonic abilities could intercept communications and interfere with enemy electronics. By the time the Vorthak patrol moved on, the Cubs had compiled a complete tactical profile of the enemy force, including probable crew numbers, weapon specifications, and likely routes for future patrols. That, Val said, looking at her notes, is genuinely impressive work. Pip made a sound that was definitely pride, then immediately tried to eat the notepad. That evening, as they sat around their small heating unit sharing what passed for dinner, Val found herself watching the cubs with new eyes. They were still young, still occasionally helpless, still required constant supervision to prevent them from accidentally poisoning themselves or disappearing into the local ecosystem. But they were also something else, something that was becoming clearer with each passing day. "You know," she said to them as they settled in for the night, "when this war started, I thought my job was to protect you until we could find you new homes." Coda's humming shifted to a questioning tone. "But I'm starting to think maybe you don't need protecting as much as you need training." Nyx flickered into visibility beside her, scales showing patterns she'd never seen before, something that looked almost like anticipation mixed with determination. Pip had fallen asleep clutching a rock that probably contained essential minerals, but even in sleep, its ears were swiveled toward the cave entrance, listening for threats. Val pulled up her tactical display and began planning their next move. The Vorthak were expanding their search grid. Soon, this hideout would be compromised. They'd need to move again, find a new safe house, continue the endless game of running and hiding. But maybe, she thought, as she watched the cubs sleep, they wouldn't be running for much longer. Outside the cave, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small drama playing out on the surface of one unremarkable planet. But if stars could have opinions, they might have noted that something was changing in that cave. Something that would have consequences far beyond the immediate survival of one human and 3 alien children. The cubs were learning, and the Vorthak, for all their military might and technological superiority, had no idea what they had awakened by threatening the young of species they didn't bother to understand. Val smiled as she settled into her watch position. Tomorrow, they'd move to a new hideout. Tomorrow, she'd teach them new skills. Tomorrow, the cubs would become a little more dangerous, a little more capable, a little less willing to simply hide behind their human protector. It was, she decided, going to be an interesting war. 3 months of guerrilla warfare had taught Val many things about the Vorthak. They were efficient, ruthless, and had all the tactical creativity of a brick. What they lacked in imagination, they made up for in overwhelming firepower and an apparently limitless supply of soldiers who followed orders with mechanical precision. What she hadn't expected was for her 3 adopted cubs to become better at asymmetric warfare than some of the veteran soldiers she'd served with. Contact. Bearing 290, approximately 800 meters, Pip whispered into the comm unit with the calm professionalism of someone who had definitely not been eating questionable cave minerals just that morning. Well, probably not. Val peered through her scope at the Vorthak patrol moving through the valley below their position. 6 soldiers in standard combat armor, moving in textbook formation through terrain that offered multiple ambush opportunities. 3 months ago, she would have called in the contact and waited for orders. Now, she looked at her 3 companions and saw a tactical unit that had somehow become more effective than most military squads. "Nyx, what's your read on their electronics?" she asked quietly. The Drakmori child had grown considerably in the past months, now nearly 4 feet tall and significantly more confident. Its scales had developed new patterns, tactical camouflage that seemed to shift based on both environment and emotional state. Currently, they showed the mottled gray-green of focused concentration. Standard comm array, basic targeting systems, nothing sophisticated, Nyx replied in accented but perfectly clear standard. Their encryption is, how do you say, garbage. Val suppressed a smile. Nix had learned human profanity with the same efficiency it applied to everything else. Coda? She asked. The crystalline being had also grown, its faceted surface now throwing complex light patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with its thoughts. It hummed briefly, a sound that somehow conveyed tactical assessment more clearly than words. Coda says their formation has a gap at the rear, Pip translated, apparently having developed some kind of harmonic interface with its crystalline companion. Also, their lieutenant is arguing with their sergeant about route selection. You can hear their internal comms? Val asked, impressed despite herself. Coda can do many things, Pip said, with what was definitely pride. Watch. The humming shifted to a different frequency, and suddenly the Vorthak patrol stopped moving. Val could see them through her scope, standing frozen as their communication systems filled with static that seemed to pulse in time with Coda's harmonics. Okay, that's new, Val muttered. How long can you maintain that? Coda's response was another harmonic burst that somehow conveyed as long as necessary, with a confidence that was slightly terrifying. Right, Val said, switching to tactical mode. Nix, I want you to circle around to their 6. Pip, you take the high ground on the left flank. I'll provide overwatch and covering fire. Coda, keep them confused but don't completely disable their comms. We want this to look like equipment failure, not sabotage. The 3 cubs moved out with the fluid efficiency of a team that had been working together for years rather than months. Val watched them go and felt that familiar mixture of pride and concern that had become her default emotional state. Pip moved through the underbrush like a furry ghost, its natural stealth abilities enhanced by months of practical training. The little Quellian had developed an almost supernatural ability to find concealment in impossible places and an even more disturbing talent for improvised explosives. Nix simply vanished, becoming a shimmer in the air that was barely visible even to Val's trained eyes. The Drakmori had discovered that its camouflage could extend beyond mere visual concealment. It could apparently bend light, sound, and even electromagnetic radiation around itself when properly motivated. Coda positioned itself where it could maintain line of sight to the enemy, while remaining concealed behind crystalline formations that looked natural, but had definitely not been there 5 minutes ago. The Volthan's abilities were the most mysterious of the 3. It seemed to have some kind of matter manipulation capacity that worked on a quantum level. In position, Nix's voice whispered through the comm. Ready, Pip confirmed, and Val could hear the subtle enthusiasm that meant the little explosive expert was looking forward to the upcoming chaos. Coda's harmonic confirmation somehow conveyed tactical readiness, emotional stability, and a vague sense of amusement at the Vorthak patrol's continued confusion. Execute, Val said. The attack was over in 30 seconds. Pip's improvised charges disabled 2 of the Vorthak soldiers before they even realized they were under attack. Nix appeared behind the patrol's rear guard like a nightmare made of living shadow, using non-lethal takedown techniques that were definitely not in any standard military manual. Coda's harmonics shifted to a frequency that seemed to interfere directly with Vorthak nervous systems, leaving the remaining soldiers disoriented and helpless. By the time Val reached the ambush site, the Cubs had already secured the prisoners and were conducting a professional search of their equipment. 6 soldiers, standard patrol loadout, nothing unusual, Nix reported, having resumed visibility and looking remarkably pleased with itself. Their orders were to investigate reports of unusual animal activity in this sector. Animal activity, Val repeated flatly. That's what they're calling us now? To be fair, Pip said, holding up a Vorthak ration pack that it was examining with obvious interest. "Some of us do have fur. Some of us also have opposable thumbs and advanced tactical training," Val pointed out. "There's a difference." Coda hummed something that sounded like laughter. The prisoners were unconscious but alive, a policy they'd established after the first few encounters. The Cubs had initially been confused by the concept of taking prisoners rather than simply eliminating threats, but they'd adapted with the same frightening efficiency they brought to everything else. "What do we do with them?" Nix asked, scales shifting to patterns that suggested curiosity mixed with something that might have been bloodthirsty anticipation. "Same thing we always do," Val said. "Strip them of useful equipment, leave them somewhere safe but inconvenient, and make sure they have a story to tell their commanders that won't lead back to us." It was a routine they'd perfected over dozens of similar encounters. The Vorthak would wake up in a few hours, find themselves tied to a tree with their weapons missing and their communications equipment mysteriously malfunctioning. Their reports would describe equipment failures, possible environmental hazards, and the vague sense that something was watching them from the shadows. Never anything concrete enough to warrant a major response, but persistent enough to make the occupation force increasingly paranoid and ineffective. "Commander," Pip said, using the title that had somehow become standard among the Cubs, "we have a problem." Val looked up from the tactical computer she'd been copying data from. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves much larger guns and significantly worse attitudes," Nix said, pointing toward the horizon. Val followed the gesture and felt her stomach drop. 3 heavy assault transports were approaching their position, moving fast and low. These weren't patrol craft. They were the kind of ships you sent when you wanted to level everything in a 50-mile radius and ask questions later. "How did they find us?" she asked, already knowing the answer wasn't going to be good. Coda's harmonics shifted to something that sounded distinctly worried. Pip translated, "Coda says there's another signal in the area. Something broadcasting our location." "A traitor," Nix said, scales flickering through patterns that suggested anger and betrayal. Val felt the familiar cold weight of tactical calculation settling over her thoughts. They were too far from their base to retreat, too exposed to hide, and facing odds that would challenge a full military unit, much less 3 alien children and 1 increasingly tired human soldier. "Options?" she asked, falling back on military routine because it was better than panic. "We run," Nix suggested. "We hide," Pip added. Coda hummed something complex that somehow conveyed multiple tactical scenarios simultaneously. Val looked at the approaching transports, then at her 3 companions, and made a decision that would have horrified her commanding officers and probably violated several articles of military law. "We fight," she said. The Cubs looked at her with expressions that managed to convey surprise, excitement, and complete confidence in her judgment. It was both heartwarming and absolutely terrifying. "Against assault transports?" Nix asked. "With what weapons?" Val smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "With everything we've learned, and everything we've taught each other." She activated her emergency beacon, not the standard military frequency, but the encrypted channel that connected what remained of the resistance network. If they were going to make a stand here, they wouldn't do it alone. "All stations, this is Phantom Actual," she broadcast. "We have Vorthak assault elements converging on grid reference Alpha 99. Request immediate support for tactical engagement." The response was immediate and not encouraging. "Phantom Actual, this is Resistance Command. No support available. Suggest immediate withdrawal." "Negative, Command," Val replied, watching the Cubs check their equipment with the casual efficiency of veteran soldiers. Withdrawal is not an option. We're going to hold this position. Phantom Actual, you're outnumbered at least 20-1. That's a suicide mission. Val looked at Pip, who was assembling an improvised explosive device from components that definitely hadn't been in its pack 5 minutes ago. At Nyx, whose scales were shifting to patterns she'd never seen before. Something that looked like predatory anticipation mixed with tactical calculation. At Coda, whose harmonics were building to frequencies that seemed to make the local stone formations resonate in harmony. "Command, I've got 3 of the best soldiers I've ever worked with," she said into the comm. "We're not planning to lose." The assault transports were close enough now that she could see individual weapon systems powering up. Time for clever plans and strategic withdrawals was over. "All right, Cubs," she said, using the nickname that had somehow become a term of respect rather than diminishment. "Remember everything we've learned. Remember why we're fighting. And remember that sometimes being outnumbered just means the enemy has more targets." The first transport opened fire, and the world exploded into chaos and violence. But for the first time since the war began, Val wasn't worried about protecting her charges. She was worried about what they were about to do to the Vorthak. 6 months later, Admiral Pip stood on the bridge of the Resistance flagship, coordinating a battle that would have been impossible when this whole mess started. The little Quellian had grown into something that barely resembled the terrified refugee who once tried to eat everything in sight. Oh, it still tried to eat everything. Some habits died hard, but now it did so while simultaneously managing supply chains for a fleet that spanned 3 systems. "Demolition teams are in position," Pip reported to the assembled commanders, its voice carrying the casual authority of someone who had learned warfare from the ground up. "Nyx confirms stealth insertion is proceeding on schedule. Coda has established quantum-encrypted communications with all resistance cells." Val watched from her position as senior tactical advisor, a role that had evolved naturally as her former Cubs had surpassed their teacher in every measurable way. It was like watching your children graduate, if your children happened to be planning the liberation of an entire sector. The Vorthak command ship hung in space above them like a small moon with anger management issues. For 6 months, it had served as the mobile headquarters for the occupation force, coordinating the systematic subjugation of everything the aliens considered worth conquering. Today, that was going to change. "Stealth teams report minimal resistance." Nyx's voice came through the comms, barely recognizable as the terrified child who used to vanish whenever startled. The Drakmori had become something like a shadow made manifest, capable of leading infiltration missions that violated several laws of physics. "Their security is, how do you say, pathetic." "Language, Nyx," Pip said automatically, then grinned, an expression that looked distinctly predatory on Quellian features. "But you're not wrong." Coda's harmonics filled the bridge, a complex symphony that somehow conveyed tactical updates, emotional states, and what might have been the alien equivalent of battle songs. The crystalline being had grown into something that resembled a living constellation, its faceted surface throwing patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the quantum communications it maintained across the fleet. Val listened to the 3 aliens coordinate their forces and felt something that was part pride, part amazement, and part existential confusion about what exactly she'd helped create. "Insertion teams are at the primary objective," Nyx reported, "beginning power core destabilization sequence." "Acknowledged," Pip said. "All ships, prepare for Phase 2. Remember, we want the ship disabled, not destroyed. Intelligence value is priority." Val couldn't help but smile. 3 months ago, Pip had wanted to blow up everything with the biggest explosions possible. Now it was thinking strategically about post-battle intelligence gathering. Growth was a beautiful thing. "Contact!" one of the bridge officers called out. "Vorthak fighters launching from the command ship?" "Finally," Nix's voice said, with what was definitely anticipation. I was getting bored. Through the viewports, Val could see the enemy fighters streaming toward their position. Sleek, deadly craft that had dominated space combat for months. They moved with mechanical precision, following attack patterns that had proven devastatingly effective against conventional forces. Unfortunately for the Vorthak, the Resistance fleet was anything but conventional. "Coda, if you would," Pip said politely. The harmonics on the bridge shifted to a frequency that seemed to resonate in Val's bones. Through the viewports, she watched in fascination as the approaching fighter formation began to wobble, their perfect formation dissolving into chaos as their navigation systems tried to process conflicting information about where exactly they were supposed to be. "Quantum interference established," Pip announced to the fleet. "All ships, weapons free. Let's remind them why attacking children was a bad idea." The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. The Resistance fleet moved like a living thing, each ship positioned and coordinated through Coda's quantum communication network. Nix's stealth teams struck at critical systems with surgical precision, while Pip's carefully placed demolition charges turned the massive command ship's own structure against it. And through it all, Val watched her former cubs command the battle with the confidence of beings who had learned that survival was just the first step toward victory. "Power core destabilization complete," Nix reported. "Ship is dead in space." "Excellent," Pip said. "Now comes the interesting part." That's when the real surprise revealed itself. As the Vorthak command ship's systems failed, massive blast doors opened along its hull, revealing chambers filled with more alien species than Val had ever seen in one place. "They're not just occupying our worlds," she realized. "They're collecting our children." The truth hit like a physical blow. The Vorthak hadn't been conquering systems. They'd been harvesting young beings from dozens of species, testing them, studying them, looking for something specific. "Commander Apex," a new voice said over the communications array. The translator struggled with the alien language before rendering it in crisp, mechanical standard. "I am War Leader Vexthul of the Vorthak Empire. I believe we should talk." Within hours, Val found herself in the strangest diplomatic meeting of her career. The Vorthak war leader was surprisingly small, its insectoid features more curious than threatening. Pip, Nix, and Coda flanked her, no longer children but clearly the leaders of this particular negotiation. "Your species fascinates us," Vexthul said without preamble. "We have tested thousands of juvenile beings across this sector. Most prove disappointing. They remain weak, dependent, prey." "But not these three," Val said, beginning to understand. "Indeed. They began as typical cubs, frightened, helpless, hiding behind their protector. But observe what they have become." The alien gestured at Pip, who was casually eating what appeared to be a piece of the conference table. "Warriors, leaders, beings who transform challenge into strength." Nix flickered briefly invisible, a sign of either nervousness or tactical positioning. "You invaded our worlds to find children who could fight back?" "The Vorthak Empire has existed for millennia," Vexthul explained. "We have conquered countless species. But conquest is not our ultimate goal. We seek those rare beings who can grow beyond their origins, who can become something greater through adversity." Coda's harmonics shifted to something that sounded like a question and a threat simultaneously. Your species calls it humanity? F. Yeah, the war leader continued. This drive to exceed limitations, to protect others, to grow stronger through struggle. We have searched for this quality in many species. Most fail. But you three, it gestured again. You three have exceeded all expectations. So what now? Val asked. Now, we withdraw, Vexathul said simply. Your cubs have proven themselves worthy. The test is complete. Pip stopped eating the table long enough to look thoughtful. And if we refuse to let you leave peacefully? Then we fight, the war leader said, with what might have been respect. And given what you accomplished today, it would be educational. In the end, they chose cooperation over continued warfare. The Vorthak departed, taking their testing protocols to some other sector of the galaxy. The Cubs, now officially admirals in the new Interspecies Defense Coalition, began the long work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Years later, Val served under Admiral Pip in a fleet that spanned dozens of systems, watching species that had been enemies learn to work together. Sometimes she missed the simplicity of those early days, when her biggest worry was keeping 3 alien children from accidentally poisoning themselves. But as she watched the Cubs, now leaders, now legends, now the foundation of an alliance that stretched across the stars, she had to admit the universe had turned out far more interesting than she'd ever expected. And Pip still tried to eat everything, which was somehow both reassuring and slightly terrifying when you considered the vast responsibilities that came with command rank. Some things, Val reflected, never changed. And that was probably for the best.